Well, as all of you are aware, we're looking at the National Planning Policy Framework changes, and the announcement was made on these on the 19th of December, and it came in two parts. There was, first of all, a statement made by Michael Gove to the press, for which he got heavily criticised by the Speaker for announcing it at a press meeting rather than at the House of Commons. And subsequently, there was a ministerial statement which was sent to members of Parliament, and one of whom very kindly sent me a copy immediately so that I got hold of that at an early stage. Next slide, please. The agenda this evening is, first of all, a welcome, which we've done, and an introduction, which I'm doing at the moment, and then a presentation on the new NPPF and other planning updates from Catriona Riddell, comments on planning changes by Chris Berry, and then comments on planning changes by Elizabeth Bundred Woodward from CPRE Central Office. There will then be a panel session where we can do questions and discussions, and then finally a summary and close. Next slide, please. So his announcement on the 19th of December covered the following topics. Next slide, please. Planning Skills Delivery Fund. This is obviously funding for people to improve their planning skills. Local authorities had to account for delivery, and this is something he did when he was Education Minister, and he said, you know, we must have accountability, and this is basically what he's putting in here. Speed of applications. This has always been a problem, and it's obviously causes concern, and so he wants to speed those up. Rationality of decision making. This is where basically a council's already decided to put a particular piece of land into their plan and subsequently has refused planning permission, and there is a rationality argument there. A league table, so that people can see where they are. Once again, as Secretary of State for Education, he introduces in the education world. And it's going to show the speed with which local authorities perform and the delivery against their targets. And a new approach to infrastructure products, national infrastructure products, to make them a far quicker process than they are at the present moment. Next slide, please. Can I just say, for anybody who's worried, these slides will be available after this evening for people to see if they'd like to. This is in a quote from Michael Gove, saying, you know, the infrastructure plan, the new planning framework, been designed to deal with concerns, objections, and obstacles which have stood in the way of the development we need in places we need it. Now, basically, these comments came up, and you get two lots of figures occur. Either it was 22,000 comments were sent in, or it's 26,000. But nonetheless, that for a government consultation is absolutely amazing, the amount of comments that were put in. And came from all areas, developers, environmentalists, from wherever. So there was a good mix of comments that came into it. Next slide, please. Now, these were his concerns that he set out at the very beginning. It's poor quality, and it's the housing is poor quality, and it's ugly or identikit and without any beauty. And he was worried about this, and he wanted new development to have better quality and to look better. And his other objections was there's lack of new infrastructure for a lot of developments that take place, and that won't surprise many of us. Lack of GP surgeries, schools, road improvements, and other amenities. I would love to have had in there recreation, and then perhaps we could have led into the greenbelt, but there you are. And a lack of a sense of place. And once again, this is basically with little boxes put on the land. There isn't really a sense of place and a sense of community. Next slide, please. So we've got the 5 principles that he said for his announcement, which was beauty, infrastructure, democracy, environment, and neighbourhood. And you won't be surprised if you take the first letters of those, you reach the word Biden. And you may have seen that in the press. The press picked that up fairly quickly. Whether that's on purpose or not, I don't know. My suspicion is it probably is. Next slide, please. So then he outlined in his announcement the 7 worst local authorities on their local plan. And you'll see there's St Albans, Medway, Uttlesford, Basildon and Castle Point, all of which are in the London Green Belt. So there's 5 out of the 7 there which are going to be affected in the area. They must provide the Secretary of State with a local plan timetable within 12 weeks. That's what they have to do. They don't have to do their plan by then, but they have to do 12 weeks. They have to get their timings in by then. There's been there were 2 other authorities, Chorley and Fareham, where there's been a poor quality of decision making. He didn't go into that in any great detail, and there hasn't been much appeared about that. He did have a particular go at London, and he said he was setting up an independent review to look at the London plan, to get homes its people need to flourish and thrive. So the Mayor of London's in for a bit of examination going on, and he did say that that would be fairly quick so that we can get on with it. Next slide, please. And the other items he covered very briefly are there. I won't read them out. I'll give you a couple of seconds to read through them yourself. I suppose the most important of those is the Cambridge Development Corporation. If you live around there, it looks as though there's going to be a massive development based on Cambridge. Next slide, please. Then he issued, as I say, this ministerial statement. And in that, he set out the following headings, which I'm not going to go to in any great detail, but just to make sure you're aware of those, because I'm sure the speakers will be dealing with those as headings. So therefore, you get those first 6 there, and those are the first 6 areas he wanted to particularly look at. And if you haven't seen the ministerial statement, it's quite a useful document to read through because you can tell which direction he's attempting to go in. I must say I was particularly pleased to see something about neighbourhood plans. It's always been a concern of mine that people have spent a lot of time creating a neighbourhood plan only for either their district or an inspector to totally overrule it, which does seem rather a waste of time. Next slide, please. These are the other headings that he has in there. And it's a community-led housing and and so on, role of beauty and so on. And there was a question, I think, earlier on briefly about what is beauty. That role of beauty is in that statement that's in there. Planning performance is basically how a local authority is behaving, and greater transparency is bringing out into the open where there is poor planning and poor performance, and making sure everybody knows who they are and what their problem is. Next slide, please. And then finally, things like additional financial support. And there's quite a lot in there about sums of money which are being put into planning now, wanting faster processes, direct action. And what he means there is action taken against local authorities who don't perform. And then finally, some comments about Cambridge. Okay, I think that's the total number. Thank you very much indeed. I now want to introduce the first of our speakers, and I have to say Catriona has spoken to us twice before and has always got tremendous acclaim for what she said and how she's helped us understand some of the things that are going on. You've seen her CV for this meeting, and I won't read it out again, just to say that she is highly regarded wherever she goes. She writes a lot in planning papers about what's happening in planning, and it's all stuff that you or I can understand, and it's not terribly technical like sometimes you read. So can I just end that by saying thank you very much for coming here this evening and taking the time to talk to us. and hand over to you, Catriona.
Thanks, Richard. I will just share my slides. Hopefully you can all see them. Yep.
Can I just say very quickly, Catriona, before you start, somebody said, are we cutting off at 40 minutes and do we have to come back in again? The answer is no. Hope that's helpful.
That's useful. Thank you. Yes, Richard's given a quick overview of all the various statements that came out just before Christmas. I've got a short time to do an awful lot, so I'm not gonna go into detail on a lot of things, and I will focus mainly on the plan making side of things because I think that's where most of the changes have actually come about, and I'll delve into some of them in a little bit more detail and obviously touch on things particular around the Greenbelt. So just in terms of if I can make that go forward. Why is that not going forward? There we go. Just in terms of just clarifying where we are in the process of planning reform, because it feels as if we've been going down this road for a very long time. But just to clarify, the changes that were published in December, they are changes to the current system. So they are changes to the current National Planning Policy Framework. They are effectively nothing to do with the Levelling Up Act, which received royal assent again just before the end of the year. The Levelling Up and Regeneration Act will then introduce an entirely new system, which is going to be partly introduced this year, partly introduced next year, obviously depending on what happens with the general election, and that comprises the changes to the legislative system around planning, but also a full review of the National Planning Policy Framework. So we're not there yet. We've got a lot more, but for the purposes of local plans at the moment, the changes that came out just before Christmas are the most relevant. Local plans that want to be to take account of the current system have to be submitted for examination by the end of June 2025. So it sounds like a long time, but it's not for plan making purposes. So there's a lot of work behind the scenes to try and get plans submitted to make sure that they can actually take into account the current NPPF and not the new system. Although I think there's probably pros and cons with both. So back to that announcement, 19th of December, when Michael Gove set out a number of different things, but primarily I think the big interest was in the updated NPPF, which I'm sure most of you will recall was published in draft a year ago for consultation. And as Richard said, a significant number of responses were received. We were supposed to see that in May, the final version in May. So it's been a full year before we've got it. So there's been a stagnation in local plans. A lot of local plans have pressed the pause button. Some of those are examination and have pressed the pause button as well. So I think the hope is that now that's published, there will be some movement again in terms of local plans because there is a bit more clarity now in terms of what is expected. Or so we thought, and I'll come on to that in a minute because I don't think it's as simple as that. So just a little bit more detail on some of the changes. The emphasis is very much on a plan-led system. So as you will appreciate, the government is very keen to get local plans in place. And I think it's right for local authorities to get local plans in place as soon as possible as well. It gives clarity to local communities. It means they've got much more in terms to use in terms of dealing with applications. But there are some carrots and sticks being introduced to make sure that happens. The carrots are around the changes to the 5-year land supply requirements, which I'm assuming most people have heard of in some form. And these are basically local plans have got to have a 5-year rolling supply of land that meets what they are expected to deliver in terms of the local plan. And that can be used to help, used and held against them at planning appeals if they don't have their 5-year land supply. But what the government is proposing in this, or is actually set out now in the NPPF, is that local plans that are up to date, so if they're 5 years or younger, they won't be expected to demonstrate a 5-year land supply. But in addition to that, if they have reached a certain stage in the plan making process, and that's regulation 18 stage, which is, for those familiar with the local plan process, that is the first main consultation stage. Now, at that stage, most councils do not include site allocations. They set out the strategy for the local plan and some detail, but they tend not to have site allocations. But what the government is saying is, if local plans do include site allocations at that point, then they will only have to demonstrate a 4-year land supply. So it's actually quite a big incentive to get plans at least to that stage and to provide as much detail as possible at that stage. The sticks, as Richard has already mentioned, is ministerial directions. We had the first of these in September with Spelthorne, and then Erewash and West Berkshire just before Christmas. All 3 of these local plans were at examination, and for some very similar reasons, there was motions being put forward to the councils to potentially withdraw these for examination and take them back a stage. The Secretary of State jumped in at the very last minute in all 3 of these to prevent them from doing that. And then we had the more recent ones then announced as part of the statement in December, on the 19th of statement. Interestingly, we've got Basildon, Castle Point and St Albans, who were already subject to Secretary of State intervention in November 2017. That made absolutely no difference whatsoever. They have all got plans that are older than the 2004 planning system and have had repeated attempts to get plans across the line. Castle Point, very famously last year, managed to get a sound plan through the system and were just about to adopt it and decided they were going to withdraw it. Under the Levelling Up Act, just to note, it's not been implemented yet, but under the Levelling Up Act, there is a new provision that basically stops local plans from being withdrawn once submitted to examination. So legally now the Secretary of State won't have to intervene in these cases. They basically won't be allowed to withdraw the plan unless the Secretary of State asks the plan to be withdrawn or the inspector recommends that it's withdrawn. So that's sort of going to cover that loop. But it's not clear what the interventions, what the real sticks are, other than setting out their timetables. And I've had conversations with a number of the officers in these local authorities, and they are all at fairly early stages. They've set out timetables. Most of them were a bit miffed because they already had up-to-date timetables. So I think there's a few that this is just sort of making a point. It doesn't actually make any difference whatsoever in practice, so we'll see. So on to the key changes. First of all, I think it's important to recognise that some of the changes in the NPPF are clarifications. They're not changes in national policy. The first one, and probably the most important one, was around the use of the government standard methodology for setting out housing targets in local plans. And there's been a lot of confusion around this, mainly because of the way that inspectors have applied it, but also because the messages that local authorities were getting from civil servants who were saying, you have to meet this target, you have to meet the standard methodology. But in actual fact, it's always been clear that the standard methodology is effectively what we would call in planning a policy off number. It's a number, it's a starting point, and then you have to apply your policies. And if you get below that and you've got the evidence, then so be it. And there are some local authorities that have very successfully managed to get their plans across the line with a significant reduction in the standard methodology. And in the end of February, Elmbridge will be the next one to go forward with a local plan that doesn't propose any release of Greenbelt and is aiming to achieve about 70% of the standard methodology. So that's definitely one to watch. So this was really a clarification that the standard methodology is an advisory starting point for establishing the housing target that you will set out in a local plan. There are some internal inconsistencies because the paragraph in the NPPF that states that when local plans are tested in terms of their soundness examination, the first test of soundness states that a strategy, i.e. the local plan, has to, as a minimum, seek to meet the area's objectively assessed needs. So that's a slight inconsistency, I think, in terms of that clarification. And again, the Elmbridge example will be one to watch in terms of how inspectors will actually apply that. The second sort of big change, I think, it's been mooted for a long time. It's been there in guidance, but it hasn't been as explicit as it is now in the NPPF, and that is the very clear emphasis on urban areas. That goes along side by side, obviously, with protecting Greenbelt and protecting the areas around the urban areas. And there is what we call an urban uplift, where the 20 largest urban centres across England have to deliver 35% on top of what the standard methodology has assessed as their starting point needs. This is an awful lot for each of these to actually deliver, but it's to make the point that there is some mileage in these urban areas, particularly larger ones. Now, that was there and it's been there for a couple of years, but it was, as I said, in guidance. It's now been included, elevated effectively to national policy. So it is a very clear requirement on these 20 local authorities. It's also been made clear that it's not for them, it's not for the surrounding areas to help them meet that, unless the surrounding areas are willing to help these areas. And for a large number of these, they are what we call underbound, so they're quite contained in terms of their administrative area. So the onus is very much on delivering this within that administrative area and not relying on your neighbours. And as you will know, the duty to cooperate has been repealed through the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. It's still there and it still applies at the moment for local plans going through the current system, but it will have a lot less weight in the lead up to that deadline of 2025, June 2025 under the current system. So what happens to that unmet needs? There's also things in there like the standard methodology, as I was saying earlier. It's an advisory starting point. What happens if one of these urban areas can demonstrate very clearly that it can't deliver? Brighton is a really good example of that. It is one of the 20. It has to deliver 35%. It's got a local plan that is delivering about 45% of the standard methodology, and that was accepted by the inspector at examination, because the inspector basically asked the authority to look under every rock, do absolutely everything in its power to boost supply within the urban area. It did that, it presented the evidence, and the plan was found sound. So it's already delivering half of what its needs are. So, what does that mean? Where does that excess unmet need go? It's still floating around. It's not being dealt with by anybody, and there is no real provision to make that strategic planning across these city regions work under the current system or the new system. And just to emphasise that, these will be circulated, so you don't have to look in detail. But these are the 20 main urban areas that have got the 35% uplift. I think 13 of them are surrounded by Greenbelt, but then you have got places like Brighton, which has got the Channel on one side and the South Downs National Park on the other side. There are very few that are not constrained or have limited constraints, even though Plymouth and Reading are there and they've got no national policy constraints. I know both cities have got significant constraints in terms of flood risk and other things like that. So there is some real challenges in this policy, some really, really big challenges in this policy. So the other changes, Greenbelt, the clarification that it's up to the individual local authorities to decide whether there are exceptional circumstances for changing Greenbelt boundaries. And that follows on from that really important Compton Parish Council and Guildford Borough Council legal challenge in 2019, which really clarified that it is for the decision maker, i.e. the local planning authority, and only the decision maker to decide whether there are exceptional circumstances. The NPPF hasn't been particularly clear about this, so that sort of made it a little bit better. Now, this is the really important bit, this next bit, and it's really important in the context particularly of what the government is saying around transitional arrangements. Now, if many of you have been following the various tensions within government itself, you have Theresa Villiers and 60+ MPs who were battling to protect the Greenbelt, to have a much clearer position on the Greenbelt. And then you had a number of other very strong voices within government that wanted it to go the other way, that wanted more housing, wanted Greenbelt reviews to be more commonplace. And so there was very strong internal challenges and wranglings going on in the Conservative Party. That went on right all the way until the NPPF was published in December. Now, this is a little bit of, I guess, the SOP. So the first bit is a new policy, and that is very clearly, very line in the sand. Local authorities are not expected to review the Greenbelt boundaries. They're not expected to carry out a Greenbelt review, and the evidence base. They can still decide that there are exceptional circumstances to review and to release Greenbelt. It's entirely within their gift, but there is not an automatic presumption that local planning authorities have to review the Greenbelt. That's really, really important, and that is the bit that has got a lot of planning lawyers very excited, as you will appreciate. So once established, and that's important, so some of these really old local plans who don't have a plan at all are probably going to fall foul of this anyway, but once established, a Greenbelt is a Greenbelt and you don't have to review it. And that's also really important in terms of that 5-yearly review of local plans, because the concern that every 5 years, because local plans have to be reviewed every 5 years, they would also be expected to review the Greenbelt. And that's basically saying, no, it's a long-term policy, you don't have to do that. So that is probably one of the most important changes. However, the sting in the tail, and this is where the other side within government, within the Conservative Party, I think, won a little bit. And right at the end of the NPPF, and I think most of my colleagues didn't get to it till well after it was published, including myself, in the transitional arrangements, it makes it absolutely clear that this new NPPF and that very important bit about Greenbelt will not apply to those plans that are currently either at a Regulation 19 stage, so that sort of second consultation stage, or have been submitted for examination. So you've got Spelthorne, Mole Valley, a number of others that are at examination who are released Greenbelt. This does not present an open door for them to go back and take these Greenbelt sites out. And that's really important because it doesn't apply to these plans because they are too far gone. It also, and this is a really clever bit of it, that it also, and this is paragraph 227, so it is literally right at the end of the NPPF, basically says if you've got a plan, you've submitted or it's Regulation 19 stage, and you want to withdraw it so that you can then go back and not review the Greenbelt, so you want to go back so that it's not reached that critical stage, basically saying if you do that, then you will still have to prepare the plan in terms of the old NPPF. So there's no get out for these plans. There is no option to go back and try and use the new system. They will, whatever way they do it, they will get tested against the old system, and that means they have to do a Greenbelt review. So that's really important. There are options for some local authorities to think about. For example, if you've got to that stage and you have released Greenbelt, I think Elmbridge, back to the Elmbridge example, I think they were very clever because they haven't made the case for exceptional circumstances perfectly within their rights. They are not in the same situation where Mole Valley and Spelthorne have released Greenbelt, maybe considering trying to take Greenbelt out of their plan, and we're hoping that the NPPF might help them. And as far as I can see, the only way that they are going to be able to do this is by reviewing their exceptional circumstances case. So, for example, they could claim that they were misled in the NPPF and that they were told, and they have to have evidence for this, but they were told that they had to meet their needs in full, and that meant they had to release Greenbelt. Now, if they can make a case around that and say that it was misleading, the NPPF was misleading, then they may have a chance. They could also say that the circumstances generally have changed and that their exceptional circumstances case that they made is different and therefore they want to review it. But that will be in the hands of the inspector, whether the inspector will accept that as part of the case. So I think the ones that are in that sort of that middle bit where the end bit where they've submitted the plan or they're in an advanced stage and they have released Greenbelt to try and meet their needs in full because that's what they thought they were expected to do, they're probably the ones in the worst situation. They're the ones that have got the biggest challenge going forward. So just finishing off now, of course, we've got a general election. Some thought it was May. Rishi Sunak seems to be saying today that he's got too much to do. So it's now looking at if it's the second half. Either way, there is an awful lot to do in terms of the current system implementation, and then we've got the new system coming out of the Levelling Up Act, and there's still a lot of consultations around that we're expecting this year. So who knows where that will go. My view is that a lot of this will not see the light of day, but we will very much still have that new NPPF. And if you look at what Labour are saying, they are going to want to hit the ground running. There's been lots around the Greenbelt. They are refining their approach to Greenbelt. Matthew Pennycook, who is the Labour Party Housing and Planning Shadow Minister, has been very clear that he does not like the way Greenbelt has been dealt with. It should be dealt with strategically. It is a strategic policy, and that the duty to cooperate and the informal almost collaboration simply doesn't work. So they are looking at that in very big detail, great detail. They are also looking at urban areas as well. Excuse me, my phone has gone off. But they are looking at urban areas as well. So there's a lot going to come out, I think, in the next few months in terms of what the Labour Party are actually saying about planning, and particularly about Greenbelt and the role of these urban areas. And that is me. Hopefully it wasn't too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Catriona, and thanks for going through it as briefly as you've done so that we've got time for questions. One of the questions I noticed while we're going in there about the ministerial statement, I'll obviously discuss with my colleagues, but we'll probably get that up on our website as soon as we possibly can. So if you want to go to
I've included the link in my presentation, Richard. All the links to all the relevant bits are included in my presentation. Well,
then it'll be on the presentation as well. So we'll get that done. That's very kind. Thanks so very much, Catriona. Our other two panelists now have an opportunity to say a few words. And the first of those is Chris Berry, who, like myself, has a foot in both camps, in both CPRE and in the London Greenbelt Council. Chris is a very experienced senior planning officer, as you see from his CV. He does considerable work, and just recently he's had a terrible problem, particularly in Hertfordshire, trying to stop the Greenbelt being eaten into by larger and larger chunks as time goes by. Chris is very much a supporter of the work we do, and we're very grateful to have somebody with his experience in our team. Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. And I'll jump straight in as time's moving on. And Catriona has very eruditely, as ever, described the NPPF changes and the policy changes that are imminent, if we possibly. And I think that's part of the problem, part of the moving, the very dynamic context in which we're all trying to work. So my 5 minutes will be very personal. They won't add substantively, but they will be comments that relate to what I hope it means for us in local campaigning for the countryside, which are likely to be in what are likely to be the dying days of a government that has never supported the planning system in any real sense, and the expectation of a new regime which may well have quite different objectives and present very different challenges to those of us involved in defending the countryside. And on that basis, I will respond as much. My comments will be to the Secretary of State's statement, the 19th December statement, as much as the amendments themselves. And my overriding feeling in reading Mr. Gove's statement several times to check that I hadn't been misleading myself was the almost complete absence of consideration or even mention of the organizations that actually deliver development, rather than those under-resourced institutions that are trying desperately to do the balancing act, that is, local planning authorities. You would think that reading from the statement that it is local planning authorities or presence and absence of local plans that are entirely responsible for the dire state of development generally, and obviously not only in rural areas. And that's such a travesty of the true situation, in my view, that it's difficult to know where to start sometimes. And the statement, and indeed the NPPF amendments as they've been published, seem to me to be little more than what my legal friends tend to call a performative exercise, content being so much less important than how it is presented and why it is being presented and to whom. And the suggestion from the outset, Mr. Gove's statement, that the reasons for the lack of beauty, the lack of sustainable development, the low provision of housing, or of communities being, quote, unprotected from speculative development, end quote, that these are down to the lack of a local plan or councils not wanting to do the planning job, is, in my view, frankly ludicrous. And it's rather more likely to be due, I believe, to the actions of a government that doesn't really believe in the development management system in the first place. So it's perhaps not surprising that the actual NPPF amendments as presented amount, in my view, to not a lot, with virtually nothing to do with the plan for wholesale reform, which Mr. Gove grandly announces. And I think the complication that Catriona has so aptly presented to us is an indication of that. And I guess I do differ here a little from many commentators who've suggested that there are big policy changes in the amendments as they have been published, because frankly, I don't really see them in either the statement or the amendments. And I mustn't labour the point, but to say that, another quote, the government has a coherent, holistic, long-term reform programme to ensure the planning system at last delivers as it should, end quote, does leave me virtually speechless. Of course, we welcome the steps that are taken to suggest that local conditions should mean more than a centrally posed algorithm for housing need calculation, and that the starting point for any greenbelt changes should be the local plan, a more rigorous process which should only be changed when it needs to be. That's all good stuff. They're helpful, but so many of the actual amendments in the NPPF as published seem mainly to inject uncertainty into definitions, which will be music to my learned friends' ears, rather than the certainty that designated protected land should mean just that, unless it is changed through a rigorous and transparent process of analysis, judgment, and community participation at an appropriate strategic level. Such a process at the right level is clearly overdue, and I believe, and of course CPRE national policy supports that, and Lizzie will certainly put me right if it doesn't. But no changes to paragraph 11 or the footnotes, and apparently greenbelt protection will now need to be clarified in guidance. So the inconsistencies in interpretation, which have bedeviled us for so long, will remain. And we know that planning officers and members, and indeed inspectors, are often unwilling to go out on a limb on the basis of ministerial statements. So that uncertainty absolutely will continue. And here a brief heartfelt cheer, if I may, for Catriona's authorities in Surrey and Three Rivers in Hertfordshire, who are effectively taking quite a risk at the moment. But they don't appear to be on the naughty step so far, but we'll see what happens as things develop. On a very microscopic level, the amendments continue the fixation with mansard roofs. perhaps the same civil servant who's responsible for inserting the word beauty as often as possible. And we should be grateful for small mercies, I suppose, apart from those who don't like mansard roofs. But Mr. Gove does at least regard us planners as being in a noble profession. So thanks, Mike, for that. But the key thread in the statement is the continuing references to elected members delivering for their local communities. That is, nervous members of Parliament and councillors. Leafy Hertfordshire, where I am after last May's election, now only has one Conservative-run council out of 10 boroughs and districts, and that one is the clearly deeply rural A10 bisected district of Broxbourne. It's a huge change, and countryside issues have had a lot to do with the turnaround. I actually believe that the NPP amendments, as they are, notwithstanding what might come, which of course is clouded by the uncertainty of the electoral process and what may happen later this year, will actually make precious little difference to what actually happens on the ground. It's of course crucial that we take full account of everything that Catriona has described and use any nugget we can find to challenge those who are really threatening the countryside. Obviously, local plans take far too long to prepare, but naming and shaming will just make people even more reluctant to become involved in the local democratic process when the influence they have is constantly undermined and under-resourced. My final comment, we have at least apparently have a new watchdog, Oflog. This can of course be pronounced Oflog, which I think is perhaps likely to be its main role with regard to councils. I'm sure that's not an original remark, but it does encapsulate more than a tendency in what is being said and done at the moment. And it's no way, in my view, to assist the absolutely crucial functions that the planning system needs to perform with regard to our responsibilities for protecting the countryside.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. We now go on to Lizzie, and welcome Lizzie to this meeting. Lizzie hasn't been with CPRE very long nationally, but she's already made a deep impression on those of us who work with her. She's got a background in planning, so she doesn't come totally to it with a fresh from that point of view. She's already got that experience, and she's got energy and enthusiasm for her topic. So, Lizzie, we're all waiting to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you to both you and Paul for hosting this joint event with CPRE this evening, inviting me to give some brief thoughts on DLUC's early Christmas gift for us. First of all, I think echoing what Chris and Catriona were saying, we are obviously very pleased the government is continuing to emphasise the importance of local plans and continuing to promote a plan-led approach. However, we remain concerned around the scope and primacy of proposed National Development Management Policies, or NDMPs, as those of us in the know are referring to them. And there was no detail on NDMPs in the announcement, and it remains very unclear how these key changes will sit alongside and will be impacted by potential new policies. The government have announced this week that the historic environment policies will be replaced by an NDMP, and we also expect that the Greenbelt policy will become an NDMP, but as I say, no detail as of yet. Changes to wording around the Greenbelt review, I think, were broadly accepted and positively received by us, although as Catriona noted, there are likely to be debates around the threshold requirements of exceptional circumstances, and it will be down to inspectors or possibly planning barristers to interpret this. The associated PPG, or planning practice guidance, has also been updated and provides guidance around infill development in the Greenbelt on brownfield land, alongside the tightening of the Greenbelt wording in the NPPF. I think this move is perhaps a response to the Grey Belt debate that was put forward by Labour during party conference season, with maybe the government trying to position themselves as the protector of the Green Belt. We did respond to these sort of ambiguous Grey Belt proposals last year, and remain supportive of the use of previously developed land. However, many of those so-called grey sites are not well located or serviced, and we believe would be more suitably handed back to nature. we really would like to see a genuine commitment to a brownfield first approach, which I think was missing in this update, and will hopefully come forward in an NDMP, along with an expansion of the test to designate new greenbelt land. We're supportive of the revocation of the 5-year land supply, as we know it's led to significant numbers of speculative developments in the countryside. But we also recognise that we have to be realistic about the pressing need for rural homes that are actually affordable to people in rural areas, particularly those on lower incomes in tourism or hospitality sectors. So in lieu of the 5-year housing land supply, there needs to be a sort of national target for affordable housing alongside a national land use framework to deliver strategic planning. We were promised this land use framework before Christmas. Again, no detail as to when that's coming, which is rather unfortunate. Strengthened wording to encourage self-build and community-led developments, paragraphs 70 to 73 are welcomed, but we would like to see further commitments to promoting rural affordable housing, particularly community-led or SME-led development secured with genuinely meaningful consent. As Chris mentioned, alongside the NPPF changes, the ministerial statement promised action to speed up the planning process. This continued focus on the number of applications granted and the speed with which they're granted seems to be aiding the argument around the planning system being a blocker to development. And it's really important that quality of decision making is not negatively impacted by this increased focus on speed of decision making. In fact, the RTPI published research, which amongst other conclusions found that reductions in budgets have forced local planning authorities to focus on development management, whilst proactive policy making is lost out, which seems to contradict the emphasis that the government seemed to be placing on the need for a plan-led approach. We are pleased to hear about additional commitments for further funding, which were announced in the ministerial statement alongside the planning task force, which were announced earlier in the year. However, really it's a drop in the ocean, and as Chris said, planning departments must be adequately resourced with qualified and experienced officers, not just junior officers, but you need staff with that sort of breadth of experience to be able to implement current and also proposed reforms and meet these sort of ludicrous new local plan timetables when they're introduced. In terms of what's missing, I think there was a real missed opportunity to actually enshrine net zero targets in planning policy, including setting carbon reduction targets for new development. So we'll continue to call for national policy to respond to climate change. And again, perhaps that's something we'll see through an NDMP later in the year. We understand that there are likely to be further changes coming forward in the spring, both to the NPPF and also a consultation on NDMPs. So I'm sure you'll be hearing about that in due course.
Thank you very much indeed, Lizzie. That was of course, well done. And we now go through to an opportunity where we start to, the panel starts to answer some questions that have been put either before the meeting or since the meeting has started. So what I'm going to do is, if I may, just read the question out and then ask the panelists to come in with their various comments. The first question is from Tim Murphy and says, does the panel believe that the removal of the requirement for local planning authorities to review their greenbelt boundaries means that there is no circumstances where greenbelt would need to be lost unless the planning authority chooses to undertake such a review? Who'd like to start us off on this one? Chris, do you want to start us off? Can you unmute, Chris?
Yes, I will unmute myself first. I think it's again one of these formative remarks, isn't it? No one is, I don't think anybody in their right mind is thinking that the green belt is set in aspic forever. We have a huge and passionate concern with maintaining it as much as possible for the right reasons and for developing public support to do that. And that is done. And so if there are any changes to be made, then it must be as a result of a rigorous process of analysis with full community involvement and participation, but specifically at the right level. It's not realistic, in my view, for individual local authorities to be able to make these decisions on their own. It's automatically at least a sub-regional a sub-regional function, if not wider. And I think that what this is doing is it's setting up a bit of a white elephant, really, to suggest that somehow tinkering about with whether you need to do a greenbelt review or not at a particular stage of the local plan process is really avoiding the main issue. And I think it's really unhelpful. Tim's put his finger on it, that this actually needs a much bigger exercise, a much bigger commitment to seek the real solution, as opposed to trying to mess about with the process that we have at the moment that is clearly not up to the task.
Catriona?
Yeah, Chris is absolutely right. I mean, the only way this is going to get solved is by dealing with Greenbelt as a strategic policy, which it always was supposed to be. You know, for those that remember regional strategies and structure plans before that, one of the important roles that they played was to set the general, what we called the general extent of the Greenbelt. So that was basically looking at the Greenbelt broadly across a city region and looking at where growth needed to go. But making sure that that was done within a proper strategy with the right infrastructure and everything else that goes with that. And then for the local plans that had been identified within that to review the detailed boundaries. Now that every plan I've been responsible for at a strategic level has released Greenbelt or has proposed Greenbelt release, but it has been done within that way. It is not something that can be managed at the very local level, and that's where we've got in such a mess now. It's not fair to expect local planning authorities to take potentially very different approaches. You look at the authorities around London, you've got every single one of them makes their own case around exceptional circumstances and can take a very, very different view. And you've got areas that are, I think Jerry Answorth's on in the meeting today from the Colne Valley. You know, you've got Colne Valley, you've got different authorities that are part of that will look at the Greenbelt in a very different way. So we've ended up with a real fragmented approach to Greenbelt. So on one hand, a categoric "you shall not review the Greenbelt" helps, but it means that we will have this significant unmet need floating around city regions. We've got to deal with that. We have to deal with that. It's not fair not to.
Thank you very much. Lizzie?
I think I would echo everything. I would also perhaps add that there is also a proposed amendment to the urban uplifts, and that there seems to be, again, a bit of a contradiction or you know, perhaps complications going to arise where local authorities are needing to meet those urban uplifts, but they're surrounded by Greenbelt and how they're going to deliver on those housing numbers. You know, where they can't undertake a Greenbelt review anymore. So we shall see. Yeah, I suspect there will be lots of debate around this, the threshold requirement.
Thank you very much indeed. The next question is from David Zerny. Given that there will be a general election this year, what advice would the panel give to a council in the public consultation regulation 18 stage about how they should proceed? Shall we come to you first, Catriona?
Yeah, I mean, I always try and put myself into the position of, if I was working for an authority, what would I say? I think if a plan is at a regulation 18 stage, it's a bit of a game of poker, because we don't know enough of what Labour's plans are, and we don't know whether they'll get into government. So it is a bit of a game of poker. So if you want to slow things down, it means you miss that deadline of the end of June 2025 for submission. So either you are going to have a continuation of a Conservative government and a very different local planning system, and there's a lot of merits of the new planning system that will come later in the year through the full review of the NPPF and implementation of the Levelling Up Act. So things like, and I know it was directly taken from something that I co-wrote, which was around having vision-led local plans. So vision-led, outcome-focused local plans, getting away from having local plans as housing strategies, and really engaging with the public. But within that, there are other things around the strategic elements, the duty to cooperate. What does the alignment test mean? You know, there's a lot of still uncertainty around the new system. So that, on the one hand, you think, right, well, we'll slow things down, we'll hit the new system, and that will give us a better outcome. And the other hand is, well, what happens if it's a Labour government and we still don't know enough of what they're going to do? So we're taking quite a big risk. And then, of course, there's a chance of a coalition government, and we have absolutely no idea what the Lib Dems are saying at a national level other than their target. So it is a bit of a game of poker. So I think what I have said actively to my clients is get on with your plan, do the plan you want. And that is the advice I have given to every one of my clients. I've said, try and take the noise out of it and do the local plan you want. And then whatever stage you get, whatever government you've got, whatever system you've got, you play the game then. But do the plan you want, make it the right plan for your area, and deal with it in that way. And I think that's the only way that local planning authorities at that early stage can deal with this. There's just so much uncertainty.
Lizzie?
Yeah, again, echoing. I mean, surely there will be some sort of transitional arrangement anyway. Labour aren't going to be changing the planning system overnight. As we know, the planning system is quite difficult to unpick and change. It's taken so long for us to get the new NPPF. So I can't imagine there will be significant changes within the next year, 2 years anyway. So I think as Catriona said, yeah. Crack on, because we need adopted local plans desperately.
Chris?
Yeah, and my only additional comment to that would be that the local plan, the local plan is the responsibility of the local planning authority, notwithstanding the heavy-handed guidance that we all get through our very centralised system. But in the end, councillors have to, in my view, and I see where David's coming from here from a Hertfordshire point of view, where we have a number of local plans at a very late stage. You've got to do what's right for the local community. And when there is so much uncertainty flying around, then it is the time for local councillors to develop backbone. And we're certainly about encouraging that. We don't know how it's going to develop. The detail is hugely lacking, and you must do the local plan which is right for your community. And we've got examples of both backbone and lack of backbone in Hertfordshire, and certainly we're very much into supporting those who are developing the backbone, and saying that actually the government needs to follow us rather than the other way round when it comes to the sort of legitimacy, if you like, of the local plan for the particular area covered.
Thank you very much. If we go on to the next question, really interesting one from Shirani McCarthy, who says, Gove claims to support community-led housing, but seems to be giving local planning authorities greater authority and greater obligation to deliver housing, which can go against the community when the local planning authority officers do not agree with the community view. This, of course, when we talk about community housing in this, I think people may be misinterpreting what this is talking about. Lizzie, do you want to come to this first?
Sure. I mean, it would be really useful to hear about the instance that Shirani is referring to. Community-led housing is community land trust, but also we've seen local communities come together and develop, rooftop solar developments on local community buildings, which we're obviously very supportive of. I can't think of any specific instances where officers have gone against that or have not been supportive of community-led housing. So that's definitely concerning. I don't know if Shirani can give additional detail whether that's possible.
Chris,
my concern on this, I think, is the office, and I sort of could go towards the end of the question rather than the beginning of it, perhaps, that there is this tension about with local planning officers who are in many cases promoting greater housing delivery within their areas when the local communities are very clearly not supportive of that position. And I think perhaps that's a bit where Sharon is coming from. And to a certain extent, I go back to my previous remark about local members making the decisions rather than officers making the decisions. That is going to be a tension. There's no doubt about that. Planning officers have an agenda too, and they see their agenda in many cases as being providing the housing that they think is needed. Where that comes into, if you like, opposition, when it comes into some sort of conflict with local community expectations and community view, that seems to be where quite a lot of the tensions arise in local plan making, and that's whether it's community-led housing or speculative housing or any other kind of housing. So I think that's where we need the clarity that really isn't coming through in the amendments and the so-called reforms that we're seeing at the moment.
Thank you. Catriona, before I come to you, as I understand it, these community-led systems are actually not-for-profit organisations, are they, who are building or getting the land for little or nothing and taking them forward. Have I got that wrong? Catriona?
I think Lizzie knows more about that than me, actually.
Please go.
Okay.
Just on the community, the community-led, in I think the way that was meant in the initial question around going against officers advising against what community want in terms of the local plan. There is always a tension, because a council is elected also to make decisions in the interests of the greater good, and they're always going to have to deal with competing communities wanting different things. And I think it's a real challenge. Where we got lost along the way, I think, in the last 10 years, is I know some councils are very much officer-led councils, and there are member-led councils. The only councils that work are council-led councils, where members work positively with their officers and vice versa. That is the only way this works. And I think somebody put in a question sort of linked to that about officers only looking at what they'll get through an examination. It's a massive bugbear of mine. The starting point for a local plan should be, what is the best local plan for this area? Not how do we get this through a local plan examination? What will the inspector want? And it's a very, very, you will end up with a very different result if you look at it from these two different perspectives.
There's a hint in the ministerial statement about the council officers recommending something to the councillors, and on that basis, Gove was looking at ways in which they could overrule the local councillors. Is that not a loss of democracy? Catriona, do you want to comment on that?
I don't. There is an argument that it's a loss of democracy, but it comes back to the point about having a plan-led system. If a local plan has been prepared through the local democratic process, and an officer goes forward with a decision that is local plan compliant, and the members overturn that. And I think then in the presentation, interestingly, I think what was it, Michael Gove called Waverley a promiscuous offender of this. They were sort of singled out, but basically what he was saying is there are too many councillors overturning officer recommendations where the proposal is compliant with the local plan, and the officers are overturning it because politically they don't want to be seen to be accepting it, and knowing that that will automatically go to appeal. So what Michael Gove is trying to do is saying, if you've got an up-to-date local plan that has been prepared through the democratic process, and an officer recommends a permission because it is compliant with the local plan, then it shouldn't. Then members should have a very, very, very good reason for overturning that. And they're trying to also get to a stage where some councils are something like 90% officer delegation, and they work very, very well. So I don't think it undermines local democracy as long as it is done through the plan-led system and it is done where there are up-to-date local plans in place.
Can I just leap in there for a second, because I might take a slightly more Bolshevik position than Catriona on that, because I think actually the trouble is that there is such a in some cases there is such a gulf between that officers are making decisions that the local plan is so out of date that the latitude they have, if you like, of saying whether it is actually local plan led or not has become so great. And that's certainly the case. We have that in a number of instances in Hertfordshire, and I think then it does become perhaps more of a local democratic problem if in fact we are saying that, you know, this is member led, committee, councillor, elected council member led. There is a lot of capability for missing or different interpretations, and let me put it as lightly as that, because it does make a huge difference, and particularly where certain members, I mean, we have one council at the moment where there's been a huge change in political direction, and there is no doubt that the tensions there are very very stressful, in fact, and you've got to decide where actually the real concerns of the local communities lie, and that's where we go back to previous comments we've made.
Can I just say before I come to you, Lizzie, on that one? I mean, I have seen papers for a planning committee of 420 pages, which were given to the council on Thursday.
Crazy.
The meeting was following Tuesday. I just don't understand how they have the ability to get through all that, and why the papers are given so late before the meeting. Lizzie, do you want to come in on that?
I think completely what you were saying. To my mind, this is why pre-application discussions are really useful, not just with planning officers, but also with members, to introduce them to the scheme, to work out those issues, to discuss those key material considerations, and address any concerns before the application's gone in. Not enough councils seem to be holding those sorts of, or only for really large schemes. And then as you say, not all councillors are as literate in the sort of technical planning language. It's not just planning policy. We're talking about really technical, daylight sunlight assessments. Not everybody has reviewed them or can understand them. So I think there also needs to be more help and assistance given to local councillors to understand those applications so that they can make those decisions. But yeah, there definitely seems to be a direction of travel which is to increase the number of decisions taken via delegated powers to speed up the planning process. That seems to be the overarching goal.
I'm going to ask Simon Leifer, who's put his hand up and asked to speak on this, because obviously he wants to say something on this particular topic. Simon.
I do. Thanks very much, Richard. Yeah, it was really a question about the green belt and protection of the green belt. I chair a resident association in Elmbridge, and we have 3 elected councillors. We've had good results in terms of protecting the green belt. Sandown Park Racecourse is a good example. Where it was recommended by the officers, turned down by the planning committee, went to appeal, was then called in by the Secretary of State, then Robert Jenrick, who then refused the application, and it was a very strong report by the planning inspector. We're facing a potential application on another large greenbelt area in Elmbridge, which is currently a golf course, and planned application for 220 units. And what the developer is going to be relying on, we know, is that there has been a lack of affordable housing built in Elmbridge, and they're going to use that as an argument that it's an exceptional circumstance or special reason under the NPPF. I'm just wondering what the experiences of the speakers and anyone on the call, whether they've come across this and what the results have been.
Okay, thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
Lizzie, do you want to come in on this one first?
Yes, I mean, to be honest, I don't, so I have no experience, so would look to colleagues to advise you on that, but I can see that affordable housing would be an offer that officers would look on favourably because we're just not delivering enough. I suppose it depends on the type of affordable housing, as we've discovered. Actually, a lot of so-called affordable housing being delivered tends to be shared ownership or discount market sale or discount market rent, which is 80% of market values, and in fact not at all affordable. So I would, yes, quite. So I would say be conscious of that.
Yeah, they're saying they're going to be offering 50% affordable housing, and affordable housing is going to be on 3 different levels. Some will be shared ownership,
right.
Some will be housing association, and the other will be discounted. So three different levels. We don't know what the split will be between those.
Okay, Catriona, just a quick comment, and then Chris.
Yeah, I mean, it's I know, I obviously know this the site you're talking about. I mean, there is a very clear, much higher bar to cross in a planning application in the Greenbelt to demonstrate very special circumstances, much higher bar, I think, than there is to demonstrate exceptional circumstances through a local plan process. And it will depend on a number of things. One will be the stage at which the local plan is at. So the inspector will have to give considerable weight to the Elmbridge local plan, which is now going through examination. And potentially less weight to the NPPF in that sense, because the plan is such an advanced stage and it's not an allocation in the local plan. So that will be that, and also they will look at the council's record on local plans. So, you know, we've had some areas, St Albans being one, where, you know, they can't get a plan in place, and therefore that will go very, very clearly against them in an application process in the Greenbelt, because the inspector will say, well, hang on a minute, you know, there's no intention here whatsoever to get a plan in place. It will also depend on whether the site is allocated as a Greenbelt site in a draft plan. So there's a number of things they'll look at. The Sandown one, I think, you know, demonstrates clearly that officers don't always get it right. I think that's absolutely important, and I think that's an important point for Michael Gove to consider. The point he was making was, if it's compliant with a local plan, unless there are significant other reasons, and these reasons can be to do with the democratic process. What he was saying is there's too many overturning of recommendations for approval with actually very, very weak reasons, just because the councillors know that it can go through the appeal process. But I think, Simon, in terms of the application you're talking about, it's a really high bar to cross, especially since there is a lot of development happening right next door or along, you know, not far away in terms of the Wisley application, whether that'll happen or not. So I think it's a really high bar to cross, and the affordable housing element is always going to be used by developers as an excuse to lever in a sort of a favourable outcome. But again, that will be weighted against Greenbelt issues, the stage that the local plan's at, and everything else.
So can I
don't know if that's of any help whatsoever.
Simon, just let me bring in Chris. Chris, can you not you not mention St Albans? There's a question coming up on that.
No, okay, but I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the affordable housing issue is just so often such a red herring. It really is. One thing that you're not going to do to solve the housing crisis is by building, you know, houses in Hertfordshire, for instance, that start at sort of 2/3 of $1 million. That is not going to deal in any sense with the affordable housing. The affordable housing. I don't like the word crisis, but of course it's used all the time. So one falls back to it by default. It's specific shortages in specific sectors. And it is not dealt with by building on the Greenbelt. And we've had a recent inquiry, even within the inquiry itself, in Hertfordshire, where 45% was put up by the developer. Under cross-examination, that was reduced effectively in terms of the sort of definitions of affordable housing to about sort of 10 or 15% most. So that's the sort of way in which you fight these, by saying that this is actually it's a red herring. It's not actually going to provide what you say it is, and that's the attacks that we've been using in appeal situations, and I think having some success with that, because no average earning household in Hertfordshire can get anywhere near to affording, under any kind of ownership or even mixed ownership, an averagely priced house in Hertfordshire. So it's a huge gap, particularly within the London Greenbelt area. And as far as I'm concerned, we need to attack it on the basis of its irrelevance in most cases.
Can I add one?
Can I do, Simon? Sorry, I must move on, but before I do, let me urge you to have a look at the Gilston case, all right, in Hertfordshire, where they got planning permission for 10,000 homes in East Hertfordshire in the Greenbelt, on the basis that 40% of them would be affordable. They announced 3 weeks ago that due to the variation agreement, they couldn't make the profit that they originally thought, and they reduced the affordable homes by 1,700. And that's absolutely appalling that is happening. And I think that needs to be quoted at every single planning inquiry to say, look, it's all very well, but this is what's happening.
So which case is that, Richard? Sorry.
It's Gilston.
It's Gilston, and I can give you the details, Simon, if we can be in touch after the session.
The only other factor with that is they are promising to dedicate, I think, 93% of the area as a SANG, as a SANGs as well. And there's another red herring right there.
Yeah, absolutely.
In fact, a small aquarium, to be frank.
Question from John Sainer. What should a possible Labour government do to protect the Greenbelt? You've mentioned planning strategically, but what else should they be doing? What is CPRE doing about influencing the Labour policy? How can we help? Catriona, shall I go to you first of all?
Yeah, I've had many conversations over the last year with the Labour front bench on as they develop their policy, and it feels a little bit disparate at the moment, because they're getting advice from a lot of experts, which is good, the occasional think tank, which is not so good, but they are pulling it all together a little bit more. And on Greenbelt, and I put up the quote from Matt Pennycook, because a lot of the conversations I've had with him and others have been around what do you do with the Greenbelt, and I think their view, they knew that Keir Starmer sort of perhaps wasn't as informed when he spoke last summer, and they have done a lot of thinking around this since then, and I think there's a few strands that are coming out of it. One is that strategic review, so basically saying if you've got Greenbelt around a city, you have to review the Greenbelt, you have to do it collectively, and they have to find a mechanism to do that, and that's the hard bit, because we don't currently have a mechanism. But that would be, how do you do it around London? We used to have a mechanism, we don't, so they'll need to recreate that. The second issue is the grey belt, and I think, again, they've got their, if you excuse it, my language, and their knickers in a twist a little bit about this, because some grey belt, in the way that they described it, is the most valuable from a green belt perspective. And the more you designate grey belt, or you talk about grotty little bits of green belt, the more their hope value rises in terms of development. So owners of these sites and investors have absolutely no incentive to improve them from a biodiversity perspective or open them up from a recreation perspective. There's absolutely no incentive to improve these. So even bits that are on borderline, they will just let them rot so that they become grey belt. So I think they've understood now that perhaps has got that could be challenging if they shift away from the current policy, which is much more about brownfield sites in the Greenbelt. However, they also recognise there are some challenges with that. So I mentioned Wisley earlier. When I was in charge of the South East Plan and previously structure plan, Wisley was never going to get designated because it might be brownfield, because it's got a runway, but it's in the middle of nowhere. And there's other Greenbelt sites, MOD sites, things like that, that because they are previously developed, there is this presumption that they are better to be developed for new communities, whatever, but most of these are in highly unsustainable locations. So again, there's some thinking going around on that. So they haven't got a position yet, and they are still talking to many, many people on this. But I think there is a very clear recognition that we can't go on the way we're going on, and that's a good thing. So any influence any organisation, I think, has got would be useful, and any practical experience, because we've had 10 years of planning by think tank, and this is where we've got to.
Thank you very much, Catriona. Lizzie, of course, you had lunch with Keir Starmer yesterday, didn't you?
Yes, yeah. All right, fine. Yeah, we unfortunately not that close yet, but we are making inroads with Labour. My colleague Jackie, who's on the call, was at party conference last year when all this sort of grey belt nonsense was coming up. As Catriona says, we definitely wouldn't want to see low quality greenbelt just wholly removed, because that just incentivizes, as she said, landowners to just do down the nature of their sites and claim that it can be developed. Alongside this, we have put out our manifesto that includes, greater protection and safeguarding of the 14 greenbelts, but also looking at potential new areas of greenbelts and expanding those tests that are currently there. I think also there needs to be a broader discussion, and I think Catriona's right, perhaps there is just a general lack of understanding of what the greenbelt is, not just politicians, but the broader public. So I think that's definitely something that we need to be thinking about, and really championing the multifunctional use of greenbelt, not just for sort of recreation and mental health and well-being, but agriculture, farming, energy, food security, nature, responding to climate change, biodiversity, etc., etc. So we'll be absolutely championing the greenbelt and trying to get our policies in Labour's manifesto coming up.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm not coming to you about this, Chris, because the next question is for you. You'll understand this.
Well, I couldn't, and I certainly couldn't match the starry company that my colleagues are keeping either, Richard.
I see. Well, this is from G. Smedley, and she says, what are the implications for St Albans at this stage of their local plan, especially the prospect of being able to potentially choose between which NPPF to apply for Regulation 19?
Heavens above. Yes, a nice easy one, obviously. The St Albans situation is one of those that we've been very directly involved in, and it will obviously be very galling indeed for the leadership there to be on the naughty step. But to a certain extent, they have, dare I suggest, brought it upon themselves. And perhaps this goes back again to the members actually having a coordinated and strong strong position, because I don't see any way out of the St Albans position other for them to go back to what Catriona said earlier, that you do a local plan that is very specifically related to the circumstances that you are facing as elected members, and you then have to tough it out. And I think even more surprising that St Albans isn't doing that when actually it is an opposition-led council, very strongly an opposition-led council, which should be perhaps making its case to the government that there are special circumstances, local conditions. It's 80% greenbelt. There is no way that the present process can be made to be appropriate for them. So the answer is for the local councillors there to get themselves in a position where they are defending their local situation on the basis of the conditions that they're facing, and sort of saying that there's no alternative, we have to abide by the government, the standard method and calculations and so on, is completely unhelpful in somewhere like St Albans, and it's not sustainable, and they are going to continue having this endless iterations of lack of decision making, every party gets upset by it. Local community gets upset by it. The officers get upset by it. The elected members get stressful. It's not a way forward, and I don't see anything, unfortunately, in the present tinkering with the NPPF amendments at the moment in the short term, say in the next year or so, that is going to make any difference to that.
Thank you very much indeed. Did you want to just add something quickly, Catriona?
No, I think Chris said it all. I mean, I was very much involved in the South West Hertfordshire plan, and that was initiated because St Albans had failed the duty to cooperate. There was a very strong reluctance from the previous administration to engage on anything, and it's been. I've also seen many officers leave the authority because even though they have tried, they cannot work. It just can't. It's just not working. It's in full failure and has been for a very long time. And the South West Hertfordshire plan's bumbling along, but I don't have huge hope for St Albans playing its part.
Thank you very much indeed, everybody, and I'm really grateful to our panellists for the excellent work that they've done this evening in answering the questions. I'll come to that in a minute, if I may. Just to sort of sum up some of the points that we've dealt with this evening. Do have a local plan as quickly as possible, and then you'll be having a 4-year housing supply instead of a 5. Prevention, you aren't allowed to withdraw from a local plan if you're already on the way, and you aren't allowed to withdraw the Greenbelt from it. The importance of planning officers has suddenly come to the fore, not only their education, but to have more of them and to get them more skilled in what they're doing, and perhaps therefore take over a slightly bigger role than they have at the moment. There's a big question mark against the standard methodology. Is that really realistic nowadays, or has it lost all credibility whatsoever? There is a hint about talking about the latest census results, but those aren't due, I think, for about another year, 18 months. There's a total lack of strategic planning. There's a hint at a couple of places where 2 or 3 districts might get together, but there's a lack of strategic planning. And surely one of the things we have learnt over the last few years is how important strategic planning is. The 20 main urban sites, that's obviously putting pressure on brownfield. It's something which, obviously, to protect the countryside, we need to encourage as much as possible. And hopefully this will go forward as it is there. Special circumstances, we're still up in the air as to what exactly that means. And it seems to be in the eye of the beholder. And if the beholder thinks that that means building on the Greenbelt, then there isn't much that anybody appears to be able to do about it. To go finally on to local authorities as such, and the Greenbelt. Remember, as far as the London Greenbelt Council is concerned, is we understand there is pressure for development, but we also understand that we need to protect the Greenbelt, and we need to protect it more now than perhaps ever, because of reaching net zero by 2050 and the considerable role that the Greenbelt has in helping us achieve that net zero. The sequestration of carbon, food production, water retention and water provision, health and welfare, nature regeneration. This gives the Greenbelt an economic value. And if only economists could understand that, we'd have made a major step forward. Thank you all very much indeed for your contribution this evening. Thank you particularly to Lizzie, Chris and Catriona for their excellent presentations and also the way in which they've dealt with the questions. We've been very lucky this evening to have an excellent team. And finally, thank you to my team for getting this presentation together so that we can all discuss it in a timely manner, so that we're all hopefully a lot better equipped to deal with some of the things we have to in the planning roles within the country. And can I just end by saying a Happy New Year to you, and I hope it's one where we can celebrate protecting the Greenbelt. Thank you very much indeed.